Thanks for joining us today. My name's Emma Oakley, and I am co-head of the real estate sector group in the London office of Taylor Wessing. Today, we'll be giving the floor to our officers subgroup, which is led by Head of Planning Al Watson and real estate partner Matt Winston, both of whom are joining us today. Alongside Al and Matthew, we have Alexandra Richardson, a partner in our corporate technology group and a co-lead of our PropTech focus subgroup. We also have Joe Joyce, who is a senior associate in our commercial technology and data team. And with the return to the office weighing ever more heavily on the minds of corporates and what that all means for the future of offices, we'll be looking at some of the issues through a legal lens, covering a range of topics from whether there will be a fundamental shift in the dynamics of the landlord and tenant relationship, to the role that data and PropTech have to play in encouraging a return to the workplace. And one theme we'll be coming back to during the course of the hour is how the pandemic has accelerated some of the trends that we had already started to see even before the outbreak of COVID-19. In particular, a greater level of engagement and collaboration between landlords and tenants, with landlords increasingly taking on a more dynamic role of service provider as opposed to just being a provider of bricks and mortar. Before we get going with the discussion, just a few housekeeping points for you. Firstly, hopefully you can all hear and see us with the exception of Alex, who unfortunately her camera's not working today. But please be assured we can't hear or see you, so don't worry about any interruptions at your end. They won't disrupt the webinar in any way. However, if you do have any questions during the course of the webinar, please type them into the Q&A function on your screen, and we'll pick those up during the course of the hour. And if we run out of time, one of the team here will come back to you separately after the event. We've included a few polling questions for you to think about today. I'll let you know when those are coming up, and we'll be really interested to hear your views in response to those. And then finally, on your screen, you should see a copy of our work in progress report, which is available from our website. That report is based on a study of more than 2,000 working people in the UK and Germany and addresses generational priorities in the workplace. And while the study was conducted during the course of last year, before the outbreak of the pandemic, some of the main themes from the study, particularly around remote working and the benefits of flexible use class, are more pertinent now than ever. So it's well worth a read if you have the time. So to kick off the discussion, Joe, I'm going to come to you first, if that's okay. Thinking about how employers can encourage workers to feel safe in returning to their workplace and feel excited about spending at least some of their time at their office desks in the future. Could you talk us through some of the ways that data might play a role in that, please?
Yes, of course. Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Emma. And I think this is really close to our hearts. Emma and I, before we all dialed in today, were talking about how nice it is. We're both back in our offices in Taylor Wessing, as you can see, and it's astonishing just how much I missed the place over the course of 6 months of not being able to come in and see my colleagues. So the chance to come in and see people from, albeit a bit of a physical distance, and having sort of strange meetings at the opposite ends of rooms is a real treat nonetheless. And, you know, with that feeling in mind, it would be quite easy to assume that actually it's quite easy to get people to go back into work. Everyone's missed it. Maybe they're stuck of being home alone all day like I am, or maybe they're slightly exhausted at the prospect of being stuck at home surrounded by small children or housemates or partners who are all on conference calls all the time. And so you might think, oh, everyone's desperate to get back into work. But actually, we know from sort of data information that's out there that people are really concerned about coming back into offices at the moment. And for a number of reasons, there's I think one of the biggest concerns, and certainly one of the biggest concerns that we've come across at Taylor Wessing, is not so much being physically in the office, because by and large people tend to trust their employers and maybe without thinking about it so much, their landlords. There's a lot of this incentive to keep people safe, but actually getting to the workplace is a real concern for a lot of people, particularly in big cities where public transport is essential. I got on a train at 6:45 this morning, and it was already pretty packed, which was a sort of slightly unpleasant shock to me, to be honest. So there are a lot of very reasonable concerns that people have. Lawyers like me are used to thinking about data and information around people and how they move and operate and behave as being a bit risky, to be honest. We always think about the downsides of collecting information and how do you keep it safe and how do you make sure you're complying with the law. But if we're clever at the moment, I think we're going to be thinking about it as a big asset. And to a certain extent, there's a lot of information and data that employers and building owners and operators should be collecting now for other purposes. And I'll talk a bit about some of the benefits for demonstrating compliance with COVID guidelines. If a lot of information of that sort's been collected anyway, it makes good sense to be able to use some of it to reassure employees and explain to them what's been put in place to make workplaces a bit more safe and secure feeling for them. It's not a new idea to be using data and information to improve sort of office ergonomics. And we often think about ergonomics as being your desktop right. So, how high is this chair and can I reach my keyboard properly? But actually things as simple as sort of where's the tea point placed and how much room is around it and things like that. A lot of information and data goes into designing the modern office space to make it feel more welcoming and to improve sort of the flow of people as they go around, often in kind of busy open plan environments. So there's nothing particularly unusual there. But actually what we're trying to do now to a certain extent is a little bit different, because employers are going to have to try and use some of the information about what people are doing in the workplace and how they're arriving, when they're arriving, to actually not so much design spaces that are sort of optimized to that, but sometimes are actually forcing people out of the normal behaviours and patterns of behaviour that they would traditionally adopt. So rather than encouraging gatherings of people and meetings, we're actually trying to keep people physically separate, and an understanding of how people are actually physically working and moving around their office spaces, as opposed to just what do people tell you they're doing. Actually having that data and having that understanding of what's happening in real life means that you can do an awful lot to sort of plan, to sort of push people into those maybe slightly counterintuitive behaviours without it feeling as if you're going sort of following a one-way system for hours and hours and hours to get to the bathroom and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of work that can be done there. And I said it's important to know what people are actually doing, because although it's really good to communicate and talk to employees and guests and find out what visitors, how they feel about a space, because they feel good about it, they'll come in. Actually, we do also need a bit of information around what are they doing in practice as opposed to what do they think they're doing. They don't always line up. So the more actual data and information we have on that, the better we can deploy it. Obviously, there's some sorts of data collection are quite manual, so thinking about the temperature checks that I had as I arrived at my office today, the use of my swipe card to get into the building. Those things are, certainly my swipe card use is not something unusual. The temperature check is a bit, but that's sort of quite a sort of manually imposed check that happens. There are lots of things and sort of new technologies that can be deployed, which are both less intrusive from a privacy perspective, but are also kind of more seamless built within the fabric of a building. So the use of sensors in particular, they don't necessarily work out who's moving around or who it is that's in a place, but it can tell you how people are clustering around buildings. How is one end of a corridor being ignored for some reason? Why might that be? Is it because it's got to go around a funny way from the lifts for it? All of these sort of things that you can see patterns of behaviour. Once you can work out what the patterns are, maybe it's a case of then engaging with employees and visitors to find out what it is about the layout that's causing that behaviour. But it's also the key point around data privacy is transparency, and I think a real benefit for this, the way we'll get the real benefits from using data in this context is also about transparency. So once we've gathered a lot of this information around what the times of day people are arriving, the fact that the office is dead on a Wednesday afternoon, but everyone's in on a Friday morning. When we have all this information and this data, not only can we use it to help either warn people when things are going to be busy, but we can also incentivize people to come in when it's a bit quieter. And if we share this information and actually engage with people to find out why are you behaving this way? What do you think it is about Tuesday afternoon that means that no one wants to be here? Maybe that's because the canteen isn't open, or the good coffee shop down the road closes early on a Tuesday. It can be all sorts of things, and it doesn't really matter. It's about knowing what people are doing and how they're behaving to try and make them feel that you understand what their needs are. And I think that's the point. It's quite hard to empathise with large groups of people who all have different priorities. But if we can use data effectively, we can actually work out some of the motivations behind those activities. And of course, I mentioned already that there's a huge benefit of encouraging people to come in, of feeling as though you feel safe and welcome in the building, and therefore probably more productive here as well. But also, if we're gathering sufficient amounts of information around who's coming, who's going, how it's operating, that means that things like the risk assessments that employers and building operators are putting into place can be much better informed. You can actually update those risk assessments if it turns out that actually no, this one-way system doesn't work because everyone's actually clustering in this different direction. It's one thing telling people to do things, but if you know they're not going to do it, then your risk assessment isn't really assessing risk in a meaningful way. So if you've got this sort of data that you can use both to engage with those who are coming into a building, you can also use it to make sure that your paperwork is robust. If for any reason there's an outbreak or a situation, an environmental health officer turns up and starts asking questions, you can demonstrate that actually you've done the work necessary to have both a sort of flexible and thoughtful approach to things, but also that you've got hard data to back it up.
Great, thanks for that, Jo. And just picking up there on the privacy thread, which you mentioned, and picking up on a question that's coming from the audience, is there a risk that some of the solutions to the COVID issue in the office could potentially create a privacy problem, and how do you balance those two things out?
It's definitely a risk, and certainly as a privacy specialist, it's the one that I'm sort of most alive to all the time. But again, there's always a balancing act. Now, and we'll talk a little bit, I think, later about the GDPR and the UK equivalent legislation and what has to be done in practice. There are certain types of technology, things like facial recognition technology, that are always going to be incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to implement in a workplace in accordance with the law. But actually, all the things that we've been talking about today, so things like having temperature checks, having monitoring sort of volumes of people coming in and out, and actually things like sensors within the fabric of the building, you may need to do an impact assessment and work out actually, is there a risk of personal data being collected, and are we covered if we need to do that? But a lot of this can be done with very little, if any, personal data being gathered. And that's the great benefit of actually building a lot of this technology into the fabric of a building. You don't need to engage so much with individuals. You can just sort of just see what's happening with the herd, as it were.
Great, thanks, Jo. And Alex, coming to you on a similar theme, really, in terms of PropTech innovations and the discussions you've had with your client base, how do you think they might come into play in response to COVID-19?
Yeah, so I think there are really two buckets of opportunity that's been prompted by COVID-19 for PropTech companies. The first one being technology to allow us all to continue using the office whilst the pandemic is ongoing. And, obviously, we don't know how long that might be for. At the moment, there doesn't seem to be an end in sight. And it's possible that some of those may continue even post-COVID. If you look at China, they have maintained some of the things that were brought in during the SARS outbreak, with regular temperature checks and so on. I know, children are tested every morning before school, for example. So even once we get through this, it doesn't mean that all of the innovation will necessarily fall away. And then the second bucket is technology to enable businesses to adapt more broadly to the changing way that it seems likely that people will be using their offices, just as a result of having had this long period of home working and seeing that it's not necessary to be sat at your desk for a certain number of hours every day to be productive. So within the first category, starting off at the beginning of of a journey of taking on office space. Virtual viewings, I think, will continue to be key, especially with restrictions on travel and how uncertain they are. Businesses are not necessarily going to want to let this stop them with any expansion plans. And so being able to see what is available to them virtually, I think, will continue to be important. There's also then security and monitoring technology, as Joe mentioned, to track movement and usage throughout the building. And this might even be on a personal basis. So I've seen some technology that enables you to track where maintenance people have been within the building, for example. So if there is a case, you can be very specific as to where that person may have been and what steps you need to take as a result. And then there's also technology to limit face-to-face interaction. So, Joe mentioned a temperature check and a card swipe. Do you need to be taking those risks of having a person face-to-face with another person to check their temperature, and having people, touching cards onto panels? Can we automate that more? And with the temperature checks, as I say, it is possible that they may well be here to stay, given what we've all experienced over the last few months. There may be a longer-term heightened awareness of ensuring that somebody who is ill doesn't enter a crowded building. And then there's also social distancing aids. So, for example, smart booking systems for meeting rooms, making sure that you have the requisite number of people to enable social distancing to take place, and to protect users of the office in that way. The second category then, for the longer term question of how the last few months may change things longer term, I think it's evident that this isn't going to signal the end of the office in its totality, as some people claimed at the start of lockdown. We are sociable people, and I think it's recognised that people like to be in the office, but it also aids productivity and those discussions that mean you can think about things in a different way. I do think it's generally accepted that we are better when we can be together. But it does look like offices will be used very differently in the future to how they were before, with agile working expected to be more the norm. So the connectivity of office spaces is likely to be key going forward, be that, an excellent internet connection, very good video conferencing capabilities. I think all of that is going to become an absolute must-have rather than a nice-to-have. And in addition, there's less certainty, I think, on occupancy rates, and that means that longer-term tracking of occupancy and usage is likely to be required. So a lot of the opportunity, I think, comes down to gathering the data that Joe spoke about, and for landlords really ensuring that you are having the most marketable space when you are coming to rent out the space, because people are going to be looking for things that are a bit different to what they had before, I think.
Thanks for that, Alex. And you mentioned, of course, there is a lot of opportunity for PropTech innovators at the moment, and immediate demand for their products. Is there any issue in terms of raising the investment to get those products off the ground within the timescales that they need to be? Yeah, so it's interesting. There's been quite a few investments in PropTech during lockdown, but what I would say is it seems to have been more in the residential space, which is interesting because, all of these opportunities that we've just talked about in the office space seem to be not receiving the same amount of investment. And I think there has traditionally been a bit of a reticence in the office space to adopt these more innovative technologies, potentially just because they've not been seen as necessary. And so I think there is potentially a bit of a chicken and egg scenario of investors might not have the appetite to invest until they see that the demand is there. But that is certainly something that I think will increase as more and more offices are opening and start to require people back. These manual processes aren't going to be sustainable forever. And so I do think that this will prompt a bit of a revolution in the PropTech sector, with more interest from investors, particularly in the early stages, which is what we have seen a bit of a lack of in the
commercial side of PropTech recently.
That's really interesting. Thanks so much for that, Alex. So I'm going to pause there before we come on to Al and Matthew, just to pause the first, the first polling question, which is, how do you think that the majority of corporate occupiers are most likely to respond to COVID-19 in the longer term? We've given you three options. A is to reduce their office commitment. B is to modify the use of their existing office space. And C is to set up satellite offices. And while everyone has a chance to give that some thought, I'm going to come to Alan Matthew to talk through some of the issues around that. So Al, coming first to you, if I may. You've had a number of conversations over the last few months with both traditional landlords and flexible office providers about what they're planning to avoid potentially significant voids in their properties going forward. Can you share with us, in general terms, of course, some of the ideas that you've heard discussed?
Yes, absolutely. And good morning, everyone. The word that rings true, and it was actually a word that Tony Travers of the LSE used in an FT article earlier on this week. It's about an ecosystem. And if you have a significant or large or multi-floor office use, within that overall red line that you've got, you have the opportunity now to bring about within that red line building a series of supporting or ancillary uses which support the overall office space. So whether that is Zoom rooms, which can be facilitated for people who work locally who want a large Zoom room to beam from, whether that is pop-up arrangements depending on seasons for retailers, whether that is, I've even heard one illustration of this which is really interesting, with East and West Coast universities from the States who want to begin online learning here in London. They may well take space on a term basis where the facilities can be used for the online learning and development of students in the UK, but on an online course beamed in from East or West Coast. So that's just two or three examples. And I think the ecosystem is a good word. How do you relate to each other? Taking Alex's point and Joe's point before, we are people. And I think what Barbara Streisand says, people need people. And that relationship part in a more condensed time frame, in a condensed building, I think is the future. And on the future point, before I turn back to you, Emma, and over to Matthew, because actually between Matthew and I, we can talk a lot. Together, we can talk. Separately, we can talk a lot. My last point is this. Really interesting yesterday, the Mayor's Commission for the Future of Central London engage in that debate, have a voice about what we think the future of London will look like centrally in the next 5 to 10 years. We'll come back to that shortly. That's it from me on that point. Thanks, Emma.
Lovely. Thanks for that, Al. And I hadn't heard of the Zoom room before, so I'm going to pop round and talk that through in a bit more detail. It sounds interesting. So Matthew, sort of flipping things on their head slightly and thinking about it from the corporate occupier perspective, what can they be doing to rationalize their office space at the moment or in the longer term?
I think, it's a real challenge at any time, and I think in any economic state or environment for a tenant to, essentially become, probably in most cases, become a landlord. It's not comfortable with that. I think what we're really seeing, both through the landlord investor tenant, the occupational side, and looking through both of those lenses, is that what is definitely happening is greater stock coming onto the market. The answer really initially is a market-driven answer. It principally is a market-driven answer. Where do they go with the space that they no longer need because of the economic drivers that mean that either they need to rationalize now, and as we are also seeing, they are certainly changing their plans. They're not necessarily pushing the button on projects and new space that they were thinking of. There's some very good examples that contradict that, like the Baker McKenzie office deal, which was very brave, and obviously just before lockdown, the Linklaters deal, both central, key central London developments. But if you're holding space at the moment, it is a real challenge. You're competing not only with other so-called grey space providers or people who are chipping their space into that market, you're also competing with landlords who have voids. It's a difficult position to be in, and I think often what makes this worse is that the realisation to occupiers when they do come to this point is that they probably have to incur not insignificant capex to try and get this space into the market and get it let. Also, depending on how long they've got left on their own leases, it can be really unappealing to feel like they want to spend any money on space to make it marketable. So there's obviously the clear market element. I think from a legal point of view, obvious points, they need to know what their parameters are. They need to check what their lease does allow them to do. It's difficult to know in this market, but, if you're over-rented, it really is about mitigation. It's about being able to try to get rid of space and mitigate your loss. Again, difficult to know if this exists, but if you're under-rented, in theory, you may be in a slightly better position. I think, alienation is really important there, but, the market is generally fairly stable on being able to let at the market rent as opposed to passing rent. Again, query, what is the market rent? I think user, again, there's a lot of talk about change of use. I'm not really seeing whether occupiers have an appetite to change that. Again, it depends how long they've got left, what their liabilities are, and what the overall corporate strategy and plans were really for the businesses. Delapse comes into play. How significant might that be? It's also, an ongoing and forever element of the cost profile of space that you carry, and is a really important one. And again, another interesting dynamic we're seeing in the market, both from a landlord and tenant point of view, is the role of the guarantors. And, are people trying to avoid situations where those liabilities can be called on? Are they as good as everybody thought they were? That's an interesting dynamic, I think, which is giving, in some cases, it's giving some occupiers a bit of leverage with landlords. And I think, again, on a kind of general space awareness sense, occupiers are, clearly looking at their operational requirements. Business reviews are ongoing. We're seeing quite a lot of activity where landlords and tenants are re-gearing leases that hopefully suit both of them in what is in a falling market, suits them both best. And then there's still, as we know, still out there, we've heard it far more around retail and the F&B world, but I think the whole government intervention has still probably got a part to play in this, in terms of, at the one end of the spectrum, occupiers who have been, in some cases, vilified from benefiting and using those government assistance lines, versus other occupiers who are still paying their rent. I mean, it's probably more than anecdotal, but certainly the press and market sentiment is that roughly somewhere between 85 and 95% of office rents in central London for the March and June quarter has been paid and collected, which is pretty good going. I think what everybody perceives as the challenge is that how that will move forward, and this what feels like is likely to be an ever increasing amount of grey secondary space, arguably leading towards, both investment wise and occupier wise, perhaps a two-tier market.
Thanks, Matthew. We've had a question from the audience, which I'm going to put to you, if that's okay. So do you think for the office sector in the next few years, you will see the rise of regional satellite offices and reduced demand for central London prime offices?
There is, as we all know, and hence, that's why the questions come out, there's a huge amount of talk and noise about this in terms of, hub and spoke, in terms of what's actually being played out. I mean, there's an interesting deal that's happened in the market that most people will have seen, which is it has a number of other factors to it, but the BP move of taking a majority chunk of space in the Docklands, liquidating their freehold position in core West End, and then doing a deal with the office group for more flexi space within W1 again in Fitzrovia. It's really interesting to see that play out. I think there is also talk about whether this is really going to work. I mean, I think that there probably is definitely more real view at the moment of people taking smaller space in central London. But conversely, there are lots of businesses who are telling us that when they've done the review of these space requirements, and something we'll come on to shortly, but when they've done this review, they actually probably realise that they want the same amount of space for a number of perhaps COVID or other driven reasons, but they just want it to be provided to them and they want to use it in a different way. So short answer, Emma, is we don't really know yet, but as I say, lots of talk about it. Let's face it, there's lots of assets out there talking about the buzzword of repurposing. Something the states have got right very well is reusing sort of satellite out-of-town retail sites where there has been conversion into office elements of that. We've seen that, in Shepherd's Bush, in terms of a rather large shopping centre getting consent for a previous flagship store into serviced office. So I think there's certainly plenty of talk about it, and the market seems to go that way. But there's this very interesting contradiction around businesses that want to remodel their space, create safe environments, and as we've heard about PropTech as well, how they can use that space much more smartly. But it's throwing up at the moment, probably in a sort of intermediary conclusion, that actually the floor plates and the space requirements may not necessarily diminish massively.
Thanks for that, Matthew. So that's probably a good point to pause and look at the results of the first polling question. So 37.5% have said reduce office commitment, 50% say modify use of existing office space, and 12.5% have said setting up satellite offices. Although, as you said, Matthew, it's quite early at this stage to be able to say exactly which way the market will go, and there aren't sort of any clear trends emerging just yet. So before I come back to you with another question, I will just set up the second poll question for everyone to have a think about. And that's, do you think it's likely that office investors will be willing to offer their tenants more flexibility in lease terms in the future? Option A is yes, I expect to see a change in market practice in the longer term. B is perhaps, but not for grade A space, and C is not really. So Matthew, you on that exact topic, do you think personally that the fallout from the pandemic might see a longer term shift in lease terms, even as between traditional landlords and their tenants?
I think the short answer is that is yes. I think we will see them. Whether it's actually been created by the pandemic, I think is what that amount, the significance of that is really questionable, because as you touched on earlier, Emma, in your introduction, I think a lot of the changes that we are expecting to see really take a grip, I think were already prevalent. I think before we come on to that, I'm a big believer in market forces and what drives both the investment market and also the occupational market. And it's interesting, I think, again, sentiment-wise at the moment, when we hear about the deals that are being done, and also in particular the stock that is coming to the market and who is interested in it, there probably is, it feels like there is still a bit of a disconnect between investment market, what people are prepared to pay, and what occupiers are saying, particularly in the central London market. And I think it's probably too early to say how that is going to fully play out, because a lot of it will depend on, as we all hope, what shape a recovery takes. People either have long or short memories depending on recovery, in my view. And I think that, if we come back quickly, a number of these items will not be forgotten, but will be less raw and less significant. And if things are more strung out and take longer, then we're in a buyer's tenant market more than the historic landlord market. But I think the key thing is that, you know, what COVID and the pandemic has shown us is that it's probably accelerated and acted as more of a catalyst, certainly in a mindset sense, for that whole relationship between landlords and tenants, which was already changing between, you know, the core developers, providers of office space, and also their occupiers. As you said earlier, Emma, this idea, this kind of what we hope will sort of continue to become a historic notion of the them and us landlord-tenant relationship is much more about partnership, you know, with a small p, collaboration. It's much more about landlords providing, you know, playing the role of service provider, understanding what businesses and occupiers want, and occupiers and businesses really being the customer. And we've already seen up to the point of the pandemic that was, you know, in a really crowded market, that was stock and provision, which was providing and delivering the higher rents and the better returns for the investment market. And that stability and length of income is obviously been at the pillar of how our investment market works, particularly to overseas investors. So I think, you know, again, some things that have definitely happened. I think, you know, one really significant impact of this whole experience is that, and some people argue this more strongly, I am a believer in it, is that what this whole experience has shown us is that the dreaded lease event, if you're an occupier who is looking, you know, whether you're in the camp of viewing your lease interest as an asset in a number of different ways, or it's a liability, you know, that lease event was a really key event for your business in terms of future-proofing the business, environment, and all the rest of it. And the idea that people can now work from home, and that will only get better, or rather work remotely and not need to be in this office space continuously, has definitely shifted that dynamic alongside an environment where the dynamic was already shifting between, you know, the service provider and the customer. You know, historically, the 54 Act was kind of your only protection. Actually, you know, people have options and have a degree of contingency. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. It may not suit every floor plate and every requirement, but I think it will have a significant impact on occupiers' contingency plans when it comes to space planning. I think also there is a real focus, and has been again for a while, both developer landlords and also investor and occupier side, on safer, greener, smarter space. And some of the buildings that are not only receiving awards quite rightly are the ones that are going to be are effectively going to be liquid. They will be lettable. You know, it'll be interesting to see how where the spec market goes in terms of where we've seen the development, the office pipeline. We have a pretty transparent environment developmentally. There's not an awful lot of new stuff coming through, but that stuff that has come through and is coming through shortly is incredibly well planned. It adapts itself already to a number of the challenges that we see with COVID. And then I think also the other piece is just the role that the flex, you know, serviced office market plays in this whole development and occupier relationship. We have already seen again some very significant uptick in the use of serviced office provider to allow for that flex arrangements for occupiers to either expand or contract. I can see that for the right product, for the more imaginative, inventive service office providers, this could be a really interesting environment for them to move forward in a number of different ways. I think it also presents challenges to the investment market on a number of different levels. But I think that from an occupier perspective, I think, you know, the office groups of this world are in really great shape, and actually, you know, other serviced office providers as well are showing what merit they can bring to what way that they can work with both occupiers and investors to achieve that safer, greener, smarter environment. So I think the final kind of piece on this is, what do we think in not just in a legal, but in a legal and commercial sense, may remain with us in terms of the query about, will office leases change fundamentally? I mean, I think there's an overwhelming sense here that commercially probably terms will become shorter potentially, and people will look for more flexibility in terms of breaks and around the alienation piece, flex on user, depending on what the space is, touching back on Al's need. Planning is one thing, obviously the L&T regime is another. I think the really interesting place that we're still seeing on existing, sort of pre-let discussions and regears is around the COVID clauses, where people will really be able to get some bite as an occupier as to when rent suspension will automatically kick in. Just learning from, in reality, a very unexpected environment where the insurance industry effectively didn't have to step up. There was a big gap, and the investor landlord community, on the face of it, has been left holding the bomb in terms of income protection, and it's the kind of perfect storm with the government intervention as well. So I think there will probably be definitely in pre-let arrangements a lot of focus that goes into suspension, timing of revenue, suspension periods, termination rights, breaks. The key issue here, the big challenge is that, as some of us have known, both operationally and client side, there are a good number of people that have come into their office and gone into their office every day during the pandemic. The government did not stop people coming into their buildings, and so there's a real challenge between the service provider and the customer as to who bears that risk. And kind of analogous, some people are drawing the analogy of excluded risks which cropped up around terrorism. In some ways, this is more difficult because you've clearly physically had damage then, and buildings couldn't be occupied. There's a grey area here, which is going to be interesting to see how that pans out. And finally, I think around the insurance provisions between the parties is also going to be interesting. My sense is that the investor landlord market will probably, for the time being, have to pick up and probably will pick up risk, as they did with excluded risks around terrorism. But again, that is going to be market driven. It will be provision driven, and it will be around, a big piece will be around supply and demand. So I think some changes definitely here to stay, some driven by, people protecting the outlook of occupiers. But I think the way in which we move to hopefully recovery will play a really significant part in how those changes either augment or get a real hold on negotiations between landlord, tenant and buyer, seller.
That's great, Matthew. Thank you for that. So let's have a look what the audience thought on that question. So we've got just shy of 36% there expecting to see a change in the longer term, almost 43% saying perhaps but not for grade A space, and then 21% there saying not really. So again, it's one where perhaps it's slightly too early to say definitively what's likely to happen, but clearly there's a range of views there on that question. So Al, I'm going to come to you next. We've mentioned already this theme of repurposing office space, and I think we've reached the conclusion that perhaps it's more likely to happen from the owners of buildings as opposed to corporate occupiers for some of the reasons that Matthew explored. What sorts of planning considerations would the owners of office buildings need to take into account? And to what extent is that likely to be impacted by the government's planning reforms?
Right. Sadly, I have no magic wand or vaccine or panacea. I wish I did. But I don't. And it's important to understand then, when it comes around to the permitted development changes to bring about the new Class E, it is not a panacea, it's not a vaccine. And the government guidance, I'm going to read it out, makes it really plain. And I'm reading it out now from my second screen over here. Depending on the specifics of any proposed change of use, including building work, it may require an application for planning permission. So the use you can flip, The fit out, the building works, the operational development side of things, that still may well require planning permission. And I think this is the important commercial planning law point. The requirement for planning permission gives planning authorities skin in the game. They have a role to play and an element of control. And control comes about by way of negotiation of 106 agreements and conditions and bringing you into the debate by way of sole contribution. So let's not ignore the fact that amongst the development boom that I think we're now entering, planning authorities will want to give away a skin in the game by not imposing 106 requirements, because they need this revenue, they need the sole contributions. So I want us to bear that in mind. And I'm going to turn now to the power of three. Big fan of the power of three. 3 Weetabix, 3 shredded wheat, 3 points. So past planning law principles. Actually, the system works pretty well. 1947, Post-War Planning Act, and the flexibility of uses under the UCO, 87. As I mentioned over time to time. Now, it is interesting, and I think, you know, for those who have been around long enough in London, where you can see our own footsteps in the snow, it is interesting that over time, the UCO has been amended, but very often behind commercialization, behind the real needs of occupiers. I think we've now seen a shift in that, where actually governments look forward and is working out actually how do we bring about a development boom. I think secondly then on current planning and local plans, the planning system in most boroughs in London, taking London as an example, actually works pretty well. They've shifted online quite quickly, but they do need more resources. And it's a point of the government reform which has not been looked at greatly in the media coverage, but actually government will be wanting to put more money in. Now that will come from central government funding, as I understand it, and an increase in planning fees. Now I think we all wouldn't mind that if we get the benefit of the efficiency and the turnaround time. I know that there's a few clients on here who operate in Wandsworth. Now Wandsworth as a planning authority, they operate large teams by way of PPAs. That's going to be the future, I think, as well. So turning to the future, planning for the future, the reality on the ground, the government's agenda and Class E use, where does it all leave us? Well, I think it's this. I think we are heading into a development boom. Government understands the importance of the industry that we all operate in. That right at the start of development, you have, whether it's PD or not, you have the professional services that lead to planning permission, that lead to operational development, that leads to fit out, that leads to all the consequential services that bring about this ecosystem that we're all part of. I think the local plan system, that will take time to change by way of secondary primary legislation. And I think the big platform really is the Class E use, subject to this. There's a crowd-funded challenge in the planning court to those changes, which gets heard on my diary anyway, the 8th of October. We'll report separately about the outcome of that, but that's a challenge to the entire raft of changes to the UCO. So things still may come to a buffer. So we'll see about that. What do I feel ultimately? And I'm going to turn back again actually to Tony Travers, who's been on the circuit obviously for a long, long time. And it's this: the creativity and attributes of cities, the dense mix of people, skills and sectors that's going to that comprise a city centre's vibrant ecosystem. And I think that's where we are. And I think that is the future. And I think the planning system inherently is part of that future. So what do I feel? I feel yes and about the future. I feel positive about it. Does that help, Emma?
It absolutely does. Thanks so much. Really appreciated. So where do we go next? Let's come back to Joe. So picking up again on the theme of data, what legal obligations will both landlords and tenants need to be aware of, particularly in terms of, I suppose, GDPR compliance when collecting and processing the types of data that you mentioned earlier in relation to their buildings?
Well, you'll be pleased to hear that even though I could talk about this all day, I won't do, because it is one of those topics that you can expand on forever. So I'm just going to give you a super quick sort of reminder and overview of what people need to think about. I think the most important thing to remember here is that all of the data privacy laws that we have in place absolutely continue to apply regardless of COVID-19. We could have bubonic plague sweeping the land and the GDPR would still be in force. And I say the GDPR advisedly, we are of course still in a transition period, but I'm sure everyone here will remember wistfully back to the time when we incorporated the Data Protection Act 2018 into UK legislation, which actually enshrines the GDPR principles into UK law. So even at the end of the transition period with no deal, the same rules will continue to apply. And what that means fundamentally is that all of the previous work that we would be doing, the risk assessment processes that we would have in place around introducing new technology or doing new things with personal data, those all continue to be important. It's going to be really important for everyone to work out, first of all, who's the data controller, who's responsible for whatever information is being collected. And that sounds like that should be obvious, but sometimes it might be a landlord, sometimes it might be their tenant, sometimes there'll be joint controllers, and perhaps you'll be working with third parties who are providing technology or solutions, and they might be potentially a controller or a processor. It's all going to depend on exactly what's happening. And everyone needs to remember that just because you say something in a contract in the context of privacy law doesn't make it so. If you are not, as a matter of fact, a data controller, just saying so in a document won't change the legal position. So it's really important to do those risk assessments and think about who's in charge of that data, who's collecting it. The principles of privacy by design and default, so lots of you will be bored to death of hearing about those since the GDPR came into force, but again, they continue to be really important here. When you're looking at solutions or new opportunities to sort of really work with data to improve the working environment, particularly at the moment, it's going to be really important that you actually run through the risks involved in doing that and what needs to be done to mitigate any particular challenges around data. And that's often going to involve a data privacy impact assessment. Most organisations will have a template. If they don't, obviously phone me or charge you money for one. But there are some very good options on the Information Commissioner's website. So there's plenty of guidance and information out there if this is something that's new to you or you're part of the business. And really importantly, the accountability and transparency principles that underpin European and now UK privacy law continue to apply. That means that you have to keep records of what you're doing in your decision-making process, and it really means that you have to be transparent with the data subjects, or people, as I like to think of them. If you're collecting information from someone, you need to tell them what you're doing with it, where it's going to go, who's going to have access to it, why you're collecting it, how long you're going to be keeping it for. And there are lots of ways of doing that. It might be a really straightforward notice. Sometimes you'll need their consent, so you might need them to sign something. Often you won't need their consent, and it's important to work out what the legal basis that you're going to be relying upon will apply. So lots of work to be done there, I'm afraid, but all of it is actually very much within the sort of, I say traditional for the last couple of years, sort of set of processes that most businesses will already have in place. So I'm afraid it's just a case of looping in your data privacy officers, your lawyers if you have them, your compliance guys if necessary, and making sure that everyone is thinking about data as part of this.
Thanks, Jo. And one more quick point. Would you expect there to be a more relaxed approach taken by the UK regulator should companies breach the relevant data protection laws as a result of trying to comply with sort of COVID safety regulations? So they're making their best efforts in that regard. Would the UK regulators come down as heavily, do you think?
Yes and no. So the ICO is always actually a very pragmatic regulator. I think of the numerous supervisory authorities that operate across Europe, we're quite lucky with the ICO in the UK. They put out great guidance. They're quite collaborative in their approach, and they are very reasonable. That said, as I mentioned before, the rules continue to apply. The GDPR and the UK legislation that implements it as part of UK law are designed to provide rules for dealing with scenarios where it's an emergency, where there's a public health crisis. These aren't exceptions to the law. There are ways of handling these things built in. So it's not going to be acceptable to be blasé about information, to collect large amounts of information, particularly if it involves health-related data, so anything around sicknesses or absence or anything like that. These things have to be treated as always, as being important and confidential to the individuals in question, unless there are good legal reasons for behaving otherwise. So the regulator is going to be reasonable. They always are. They're going to listen to, particularly if there are emergency scenarios or difficult decisions have to be taken, they will absolutely work with organisations. And I don't anticipate them handing down huge fines for businesses that are stuck in tricky scenarios. But I also don't see them being lenient about people who don't run through the processes, don't do those risk assessments, don't engage with the issue of data. If people are simply thinking, well, the GDPR doesn't apply right now, this is an emergency, the ICO is not going to be sympathetic to that view at all.
Okay, thank you, Jo. So, Alex, I think coming back to you again for one final point, I think it's fair to say that some of the PropTech startups have faced a degree of resistance from the real estate industry, which is obviously a fairly traditional one still. Would you expect, and do your clients expect that some of those challenges might fall away now as a reaction to COVID-19, and that there will be wider take-up of some of the PropTech offerings?
Yeah, so as you say, I think the real estate industry as a whole was quite slow to adopt new technologies at the rate that they were being built, but that goes for commercial real estate in particular, where it feels like the full potential of all of the innovation that was happening hasn't really been realised, with the view seeming to be, if it's not broken, don't fix it. And that's understandable, because why would landlords spend money on something that they don't need or that wasn't going to generate a good return on investment for them? I think COVID-19 really does change that. As I mentioned, I think it will be absolutely necessary to adopt new solutions. They're no longer a nice to have. They will be required in order to make sure that office space can be utilised in a way that keeps everybody safe, encourages people to feel safe and therefore be willing to use the space, whilst also observing the government regulations. And all of that will come together to enable the businesses that take those spaces to thrive. And that's obviously good for all concerned. And also supporting the increased level of flexibility that it looks like will be here to stay. So my view, and I know that this is shared by a number of investors in the space, is that landlords can't simply ignore these challenges. If they do, I think they risk losing tenants over the longer term, and having unoccupied space, or at the very least not being able to command the same rents that they otherwise should be able to for the premises in the location that they may be, if the person next door has adopted all of these innovations that enables the office space to be used in a much better and easier way.
Thank you for that, Alex. So I can see we're almost at the hour. There are a few more questions that we've had through, but what we'll do is one of the team will come back separately on those, because I'm conscious of not running over. So I think all that remains to be said is thank you so much for everyone's time today in joining us, and to each of our presenters, Matthew, Al, Alex and Jo. Any questions, further questions on what we talked about today, please do get in touch with one of the team, and we'll be delighted to help. And thank you, and have a good day.
Ciao, ciao.